When I told them I passed the bar exam, my boyfriend's mother said, "Did they lower the standards this year?" The whole family burst out laughing around the Thanksgiving table while I sat there holding my acceptance letter to the state bar, and my boyfriend Thomas just kept eating his turkey like nothing was happening. "No, seriously, how did you pass? You went to that state school, didn't you?" His mother Kendall was wiping tears from laughing so hard. "I heard they let anyone take it now. Participation trophies for everyone." His brother Andrew, who'd failed the bar 3 times, chimed in. "They must have graded on a curve. No way you scored higher than me and I went to Princeton." He hadn't gone to Princeton. He'd gone to a community college, then transferred to an online university, but his family rewrote history. "I studied for 2 years and passed on my first try." Kendall laughed harder. "First try? They probably felt sorry for you. A girl from your background trying so hard. The examiners probably gave you pity points." My background was middle class just like theirs, but they acted like I'd grown up in poverty. "There's no pity points on the bar exam." Thomas finally spoke, but not to defend me. "Maybe she got lucky. Multiple choice, right? Even guessing gets you somewhere." It wasn't just multiple choice, and he knew that because I'd explained it 100 times. I scored in the 91st percentile. His father, Richard, nearly choked on his wine. 91st? That's impossible. "Thomas, show me her results. She's obviously confused about how percentiles work." Thomas actually reached for my letter. "Yeah, let me see. Maybe you read it wrong, babe." I pulled the letter away. "I read it correctly. I'm now a licensed attorney." Kendall stood up and walked over to me. "Sweetie, we need to talk about honesty in this family. If you're going to marry Thomas, you can't start with lies. It's okay that you failed. Andrew failed 3 times and we still love him." She said it condescendingly like I was a child. But Andrew's different. He had harder questions. They discriminate against white men now. Andrew nodded eagerly. "Exactly. They probably gave you easier questions. Diversity quotas." I stared at them. "I'm white. What diversity quota would I fill?" Kendall had an answer ready. "Woman quota. They need more female lawyers to look progressive even if they're not qualified." Thomas's sister Rachel laughed from across the table. "Remember when she said she wanted to be a lawyer? We all thought she meant paralegal. This is hilarious." She'd never gone to college but felt superior because she'd married rich. "I've been in law school for 3 years. You've been to my graduation." Thomas shrugged. "We thought it was one of those easy law schools, like online or something. I'd gone to the state university with an excellent law program. You drove me to campus hundreds of times." Richard pulled out his phone. "I'm looking up pass rates. Says here only 30% pass on their first try. No way you're in that 30%. He showed everyone his phone like it was proof I was lying. "Look at her transcripts then. They're on the fridge." Kendall walked to the fridge where I'd proudly displayed my grades. "These are obviously fake. Nobody gets straight A's in law school. Thomas, did you know she was fabricating documents?" Thomas looked at them seriously. "I mean, they do look too perfect. Maybe we should verify them." My own boyfriend was suggesting I'd forged my transcripts. "Call the school then. Verify them right now." Kendall was already dialing. "Yes, I need to verify a student's records. Her name is..." She put it on speaker. The registrar confirmed everything. My grades, my graduation, my class rank, 3rd out of 200. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Andrew spoke. "She must have slept with the professors." No other explanation. Thomas didn't defend me. He just looked at me suspiciously. "You did spend a lot of time in office hours." I stood up. "I'm leaving." Kendall grabbed my arm. "You can't leave. We're not done discussing your lies." I looked at her hand on my arm. "Touch me again and I'll sue you for assault. I'm a lawyer now, remember?" She let go quickly. "You wouldn't dare. You need this family. Thomas is the best you'll ever get." Thomas nodded. "She's right. Without me, you're just another lawyer drowning in debt. My family has connections. We could make sure you never work at a real firm." Richard joined in. "Every firm in the state golfs at my country club. One word from me and you're blacklisted." Rachel was recording on her phone. "This is going in the family memories." The time Thomas's girlfriend pretended to be smart. I walked to the door. "Thomas, we're done." He laughed. "You're breaking up with me?" "Over what? My family having realistic expectations about your abilities?" Kendall smirked. "She'll be back." Where else would she go? Who else would want a woman who lies about her accomplishments? 6 months later, I was working at the district attorney's office when Andrew got arrested for a DUI. The case file landed on my desk Monday morning with a yellow sticky note from my supervisor. I picked it up and saw the name typed across the top. Andrew Miller. My hand started shaking before I even opened the folder. The arrest report showed he'd been driving with a blood alcohol level of 0.17, nearly twice the legal limit. 6 months had passed since I walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner, and now I was going to face his family again in a courtroom where they couldn't dismiss me or mock my credentials. I spent the rest of the morning reading through every page of the file. This wasn't Andrew's first DUI. 3 years ago, he'd been arrested for the same thing, but his father hired an expensive lawyer who got the charges dismissed on a technicality. The current charges were more serious: DUI, reckless driving, and leaving the scene of a minor accident. The police report said he'd sideswiped a parked car on Maple Street before driving 3 more blocks, and a witness called 911 after watching him weave across the center line. The arresting officer found him slumped over the steering wheel at a red light with an open vodka bottle in the passenger seat. I closed the file and stared at my computer screen. My phone rang during lunch and I saw Cheryl's name on the display. She'd seen Andrew's name in the court filings that morning and wanted to make sure I was okay. I told her I was fine, that this was just another case, but my voice broke when I admitted I was scared of seeing Thomas's family in a professional setting after everything they'd said to me. She reminded me that I'd earned my position at the DA's office, and that I had every right to prosecute this case. When I got back to my desk, Caitlin was standing there looking at the case file I'd left open. She asked if there was a conflict of interest she needed to know about. I explained my history with the defendant's family, how I'd dated his brother for 2 years, how they'd treated me at Thanksgiving. She listened without interrupting, and then said that unless I'd dated Andrew himself, I was clear to prosecute the case. She'd supervise closely to make sure everything stayed professional and above board. The arraignment was scheduled for Thursday morning, which gave me 3 days to prepare. I pulled every DUI case from the past 5 years and read through the precedents and sentencing guidelines until I knew this area of law better than anything I'd studied for the bar exam. I made notes on similar cases where defendants had left accident scenes, on blood alcohol levels this high, on prior dismissed charges. Wednesday night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining Kendall cornering me in the courthouse hallway, or Richard trying to intimidate me the way he'd threatened to blacklist me from every firm in the state. At 3 a.m, I got up and stood in front of my bathroom mirror practicing my opening statement. I went through it 15 times until my voice sounded steady and confident instead of shaky and nervous. Thursday morning, I arrived at the courthouse an hour early wearing my most professional navy suit. The bailiff recognized me from previous cases, and we talked about his daughter's college applications while I waited in the hallway. The conversation helped calm my nerves before I had to face whatever members of Thomas's family showed up to support Andrew. Kendall and Richard arrived 15 minutes before the arraignment was scheduled to start. I watched from across the hallway as they walked past me without recognizing me at first. Then Kendall's eyes landed on my face and all the color drained from her cheeks. She grabbed Richard's arm and started whispering urgently while pointing in my direction. I could see the shock and anger spreading across his face as he realized who I was. Thomas showed up right before we were called into the courtroom. He actually started walking toward me before the bailiff stepped between us and explained that prosecutors couldn't have private conversations with defendants' family members. The look on Thomas's face when he understood that I was the prosecutor handling his brother's case made the 6 months of doubt and pain almost worth it. We filed into the courtroom and I took my place at the prosecution table. Andrew stood next to his defense attorney, a man named Declan Hardy, who I recognized from other cases. Andrew wouldn't look at me. Sweat was forming on his forehead, even though the courtroom was cold enough that I could see my breath when I spoke. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him while Declan stood and cleared his throat. He spoke about Andrew's ties to the community, his family's presence in the courtroom, his stable employment at his father's company. He mentioned the lack of prior convictions and asked for reasonable bail with standard conditions. I listened to every word and made notes on my legal pad about what I needed to counter. When Declan finished, the judge turned to me and asked for the state's position on bail. I stood up and felt my legs steady beneath me despite my racing pulse. I outlined the previous dismissed DUI from 3 years ago that showed a pattern of behavior. I described how Andrew left the scene after hitting the parked car, which demonstrated a willingness to evade responsibility. I requested $50,000 bail with mandatory installation of an ignition interlock device on any vehicle he drove. Declan objected and said the previous case was dismissed and shouldn't factor into bail considerations. The judge asked me to respond, and I cited the relevant case law about considering dismissed charges when evaluating flight risk and danger to the community. The judge nodded slowly and announced bail would be set at $40,000 with the interlock requirement. He scheduled the preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out and reminded Andrew that any violation of bail conditions would result in immediate revocation. The bailiff called the next case and we all gathered our materials to leave. I walked toward the courtroom doors and heard Kendall's voice rising behind me. She was telling Richard that I was clearly abusing my position to target their family, that this was personal revenge disguised as prosecution. Her words carried across the courtroom, but I kept my eyes forward and pushed through the doors into the hallway. My hands were shaking as I walked toward the elevator, but I didn't let myself look back or respond. The elevator doors closed, and I finally let out the breath I'd been holding since the judge announced his decision. Back at the office, I dropped my files on my desk and sat down hard in my chair. Caitlin appeared in my doorway within minutes and asked how the arraignment went. I told her about Declan's bail argument, about my response citing Andrew's previous dismissed case, about the judge setting bail at $40,000 with the interlock device. Then I mentioned Kendall's accusation in the hallway about me abusing my position for personal revenge. Caitlin laughed and leaned against the doorframe. She said that was completely standard behavior from family members when their loved one faced real consequences for the first time. She added that my bail recommendation was actually more lenient than what she would have suggested given Andrew's history of having a previous DUI dismissed through expensive lawyers. She told me I'd handled everything exactly right, and that the judge clearly agreed based on his ruling. Her words settled something anxious in my chest, and I managed to smile for the first time since seeing Kendall's face in the courthouse hallway. That evening, my doorbell rang, and I found Cheryl standing there with bags of takeout and 2 bottles of wine. She pushed past me into my apartment and started unpacking food on my coffee table without waiting for an invitation. We sat on my couch with plates of pad thai, and she asked me to tell her everything about the arraignment. I described Kendall's shock when she first recognized me, Thomas trying to approach me before the bailiff stopped him, Andrew's sweating face during the proceedings, the family's barely concealed anger when the judge set bail higher than they expected. Cheryl listened and ate her noodles and finally said I'd handled it with more grace than they deserved. She pointed out that my professionalism probably made Kendall even more angry than any personal confrontation could have. She reminded me that 6 months ago I'd been sitting at their Thanksgiving table while they laughed at my bar exam results, and now I was prosecuting their son in a criminal case. She raised her wine glass and said that was the definition of living well being the best revenge. We clinked glasses, and I felt something unknot in my shoulders that had been tight since Thursday morning. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into preparing for the preliminary hearing. I scheduled an interview with the arresting officer and spent 2 hours going through his report line by line. He walked me through the entire traffic stop, from first noticing Andrew's erratic driving to finding him slumped over the steering wheel 3 blocks from the accident scene. I took detailed notes about every observation and procedure he'd followed. Then I requested the dashcam footage from the police department and watched it 15 times in my office. The video showed Andrew's car swerving between lanes on a busy street just after 9 at night. He drifted into the oncoming traffic lane twice before jerking back. Then he came within inches of hitting a woman crossing at a crosswalk, close enough that she jumped back onto the curb and dropped her grocery bags. 30 seconds later, the video captured him sideswiping a parked Honda and continuing to drive for 3 more blocks before pulling over. The footage was damning evidence that would make the reckless driving charge nearly impossible to defend. I made clips of the most significant moments and prepared a presentation for the preliminary hearing. 1 week before the hearing, Declan filed a motion to suppress the breathalyzer results. His argument claimed the arresting officer hadn't followed proper protocol for administering the test. I read through the motion 3 times and felt my stomach drop. If the breathalyzer evidence got thrown out, the entire DUI charge could collapse. I spent that entire weekend in my apartment surrounded by procedure manuals and training documents. I researched every requirement for breathalyzer administration in our state. I called the police department and requested copies of the device's calibration records and maintenance logs. I reviewed the arresting officer's training certifications and found documentation of his completion of the standardized field sobriety test course just 4 months before Andrew's arrest. By Sunday night, I had a 20-page response to Declan's motion with supporting documentation for every single procedure the officer had followed. I wasn't going to let a technical mistake compromise this case. The hearing on the suppression motion took place in a smaller courtroom than the arraignment. I arrived early and set up my presentation materials while Declan arranged his files at the defense table. The judge entered and we both stood until he took his seat. Declan presented his argument first, claiming the officer had failed to observe Andrew for the required 15 minutes before administering the breathalyzer. He suggested this violation of protocol meant the results were unreliable and should be excluded from evidence. When my turn came, I called the arresting officer to the stand. He testified about his 8 years of experience and his recent training certification. I walked him through every step he'd taken during Andrew's arrest. He explained how he'd observed Andrew from the moment of the traffic stop through the field sobriety tests, and then during transport to the station. He'd maintained constant observation for over 30 minutes before administering the breathalyzer. Declan cross-examined and tried to create doubt about the calibration records for the breathalyzer device. I had the maintenance logs ready and presented documentation proving the device had been properly maintained and certified just 2 weeks before Andrew's arrest. The records showed regular calibration checks and all results within acceptable ranges. The judge reviewed the documents I'd submitted and asked Declan if he had any evidence that proper procedures weren't followed. Declan admitted he had no direct evidence, but maintained that the officer's report lacked sufficient detail about the observation period. The judge denied the motion to suppress and ruled that the breathalyzer results would be admissible at trial. I packed up my files and glanced toward the gallery where Richard sat with his jaw clenched tight. Kendall leaned over to whisper something to Thomas, who'd taken time off work to attend this hearing just like he had for the arraignment. All three of them stared at me with anger written across their faces as I walked past their row toward the exit. I kept my expression neutral and my eyes forward until I reached the hallway. I was walking through the parking garage toward my car when I heard footsteps behind me. Thomas called my name and I stopped but didn't turn around. He came around to face me and asked if we could talk. He said he understood now that he should have defended me at Thanksgiving. His voice was quiet, and he looked at the concrete floor instead of meeting my eyes. I told him we had nothing to discuss outside of the courtroom since I was prosecuting his brother's case. Any conversation between us could be seen as improper contact, and I wasn't going to compromise my professional ethics. He took a step closer and said he just wanted 5 minutes to apologize. I stepped back and reminded him that he might be called as a witness about Andrew's drinking patterns, given that they lived together for 2 years. Any contact between us could be considered witness tampering. The legal terminology made him stop moving and his expression shifted from pleading to frustrated. Thomas kept trying anyway. He said his family was wrong about me, and that seeing me in court made him realize how impressive my accomplishments actually were. He talked about how professional I'd been during the hearings, and how thoroughly I'd prepared my arguments. He said he could see now that I really was as smart as my law school transcripts showed. I looked at him directly for the first time since he'd caught up to me. I pointed out that it took me prosecuting his brother for drunk driving before he could respect my law degree. I told him that fact revealed everything I needed to know about his character and his family's values. 6 months ago, I'd been sitting at his family's table holding my bar exam results while everyone laughed and suggested I'd fabricated my transcripts. Now he wanted to apologize because he'd finally seen proof of my competence in a context he couldn't dismiss. I said that wasn't growth or understanding. It was just him finally being forced to acknowledge reality. I turned and walked to my car while he stood there watching me leave. I watched him walk away and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to stop my hands from shaking. The steering wheel felt cold under my palms, and I kept replaying his words about finally respecting me because he'd seen me in court. That wasn't respect. That was just him being forced to acknowledge reality when he couldn't ignore it anymore. I drove back to the office and tried to focus on paperwork, but kept staring at the same page without reading anything. Caitlin knocked on my cubicle wall around 3 o'clock and asked if I had time to discuss a new case assignment. She led me to a conference room where files covered the entire table. She explained she was prosecuting a major fraud case involving a financial advisor who'd stolen retirement savings from elderly clients and needed someone to help with witness preparation and trial strategy. I would be second chair, which meant I'd handle some witnesses and arguments, but she'd lead the case. I told her I'd be honored to work with her, and she smiled, saying she specifically requested me because my preparation on Andrew's case impressed everyone in the office. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned more about trial work than an entire semester of law school had taught me. Caitlin showed me how to organize exhibits for maximum impact, how to prepare witnesses without feeding them answers, how to anticipate defense strategies and counter them before they developed. We spent hours reviewing financial documents and building a timeline of the fraud scheme. The work consumed my days and pushed thoughts of Thomas and his family to the background where they belonged. The preliminary hearing for Andrew's DUI got scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early spring. I'd spent weeks preparing a thorough presentation of evidence, including the dashcam footage from the patrol car, breathalyzer results showing his blood alcohol level at 0.19, witness statements from the owner of the damaged car, and testimony from the arresting officer. Declan had filed a notice indicating he planned to argue that the evidence didn't support the reckless driving charge, claiming Andrew's erratic driving could have been caused by a medical emergency, rather than intoxication. I'd prepared responses to every possible argument he might make. The night before the hearing, I was reviewing my notes one final time when Cheryl called to tell me Rachel had posted a photo on social media. I pulled up Rachel's account and saw the whole family gathered around a restaurant table with a caption about supporting each other through difficult times. Someone had tagged me in the comments asking if I was the prosecutor on Andrew's case. I didn't respond, but Cheryl had already taken screenshots in case we needed to argue jury pool contamination later if the case went to trial. I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, but kept thinking about facing them all in court again. The preliminary hearing started at 9 o'clock. I arrived early and set up my exhibits while the bailiff arranged the courtroom. Kendall and Richard came in first and took seats in the front row of the gallery. Thomas arrived a few minutes later and sat beside them. Rachel showed up right before the judge entered, carrying her phone like she might try to record again until the bailiff warned her that cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom. The judge called the case and I stood to present the evidence. I'd connected my laptop to the courtroom screen and started with the dashcam footage. The video showed Andrew's car weaving between lanes on a busy street, crossing the center line twice and nearly hitting a pedestrian in a crosswalk before sideswiping a parked car and continuing down the street. I watched the judge's expression grow increasingly serious as the footage played. The near miss with the pedestrian was particularly bad. Andrew's car came within inches of hitting a woman crossing legally with the walk signal. I heard Kendall gasp from the gallery when that moment played, and I paused the video to let the image sit on the screen. The judge leaned forward to study the frozen frame showing how close Andrew had come to killing someone. The arresting officer took the stand next, and I walked him through his testimony. He described responding to a call about a hit-and-run accident and finding Andrew's car 3 blocks away, pulled halfway onto a sidewalk with the engine still running. Andrew was slumped over the steering wheel. The officer knocked on the window, and Andrew didn't respond at first. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. The officer opened the door and immediately smelled alcohol. Andrew couldn't stand without support, and his speech was so slurred the officer couldn't understand most of what he said. When asked to recite the alphabet, Andrew got to the letter G before trailing off and staring blankly at the officer. The officer noticed an open vodka bottle in the passenger seat with about a quarter of the liquid remaining. Andrew refused to say how much he'd drunk or when he'd started drinking. The breathalyzer at the scene showed .19, and the official test at the station an hour later still showed .17. Declan Cross examined the officer and tried to suggest Andrew might have been experiencing a medical emergency that mimicked intoxication. The officer calmly responded that in his 12 years of experience, he'd never seen a medical emergency that came with an open vodka bottle in the passenger seat and the strong smell of alcohol on someone's breath. Declan tried a few more questions, but the officer's testimony was solid, and his answers didn't change. The judge took about 30 seconds to make his ruling. He found probable cause on all charges, including the DUI, the reckless driving, and leaving the scene of an accident. He scheduled the case for trial in 6 weeks and set a pretrial conference for 3 weeks out. I packed up my files and laptop while the judge explained the next steps to Andrew and Declan. As I walked toward the courtroom exit, I passed the row where Richard sat. He was leaning over to whisper to Declan, and I heard him say they needed a better lawyer, someone with connections who could make this go away. Declan's response was quiet but clear. He told Richard the evidence was what it was, regardless of who presented the defense, and that any competent attorney would give the same advice he was about to give. I kept walking and didn't look back. 2 days later, Declan called my office number and asked if I had time to discuss a possible plea negotiation. He acknowledged the evidence was strong, particularly the dashcam footage showing the near miss with the pedestrian. He suggested Andrew would plead guilty to the DUI and reckless driving charges in exchange for dropping the leaving the scene charge. In return for the guilty plea, he wanted a recommendation for minimum jail time and maximum community service. I told him I needed to discuss it with my supervisors and would get back to him. I walked down the hall to Caitlin's office and explained the offer. She pulled up Andrew's record on her computer and confirmed this would be his first conviction despite the previous dismissed DUI. She suggested we talk to Roy Cameron before making a decision. We found Roy in his office reviewing case files and laid out the situation. He listened carefully and asked about the strength of our evidence. I described the dashcam footage and the officer's testimony. Roy pointed out that taking this to trial would be expensive for the county, and the outcome wasn't guaranteed with a jury despite the strong evidence. A guilty plea with real consequences would serve justice adequately and save resources for cases that actually needed to go to trial. Caitlin agreed and said we should accept the plea, but with specific terms that ensured Andrew faced meaningful punishment. I went back to my office and drafted an email to Declan outlining our acceptance of the plea with specific terms. Andrew must plead guilty to both the DUI and reckless driving charges. He would serve 45 days in county jail with no early release. He must complete 200 hours of community service within 1 year. He must attend mandatory alcohol counseling for 1 full year with proof of attendance. He must pay full money back to fix the damaged car, including any costs the owner had for a rental vehicle. He would lose his license for 18 months starting immediately. After getting his license back, he must have an ignition interlock device installed in any vehicle he drives for 2 years. I read through the terms 3 times to make sure I hadn't missed anything, then sent the email to Declan and copied Caitlin and Roy. I sat back in my chair and felt something close to satisfaction. Andrew would face real consequences for driving drunk and nearly killing someone. His family couldn't make this disappear with money or connections. The evidence was too strong and the plea terms were fair but firm. Justice was actually being served regardless of who his father played golf with, or how much money they spent on lawyers. I sent the email to Declan and spent the rest of the afternoon working on witness prep for the fraud case. My phone rang around 3 o'clock and I saw Declan's number on the screen. I picked up and he got straight to the point, saying Andrew's family was pushing him hard to reject the plea offer and take the case to trial. Richard apparently told him that no jury in the county would convict Andrew based on his background and character. Kendall kept insisting the whole thing was a mistake, and that any reasonable jury would see Andrew was just having a bad night. I let Declan finish before responding that the decision belonged to his client, not his client's parents. I reminded him the dashcam footage showed Andrew nearly hitting that pedestrian, and the breathalyzer results were solid. I also mentioned that if Andrew testified about his character during trial, the prosecution could potentially bring up the previous dismissed DUI to counter that testimony. Declan went quiet for a moment and then said he'd talk to Andrew about the realities of going to trial versus accepting the plea. He hung up and I sat there staring at my computer screen, knowing Richard and Kendall were probably in Declan's office right now telling him how to do his job. 3 days went by without hearing anything from Declan. I worked on other cases and tried not to think about Andrew's family sitting around their dining room table strategizing about how to beat the charges. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang again, and Declan sounded tired when he started talking. He told me Andrew wanted to accept the plea agreement, but Richard was threatening to stop paying the legal fees if Andrew didn't fight the charges in court. I could hear the frustration in Declan's voice as he explained that his actual client wanted one thing, while the person paying the bills wanted something completely different. I suggested he have a frank conversation with Andrew about who was facing potential jail time and who would have to live with the consequences of whatever decision got made. I told Declan I needed a final answer by Friday, or the plea offer would expire and we'd be going to trial. He thanked me for the extension and said he'd make it clear to everyone involved that this was Andrew's choice to make. After I hung up, I walked down to Caitlin's office and told her about the situation. She shook her head and said it happened all the time with wealthy families who thought they could control everything, including the criminal justice system. Friday morning, I was reviewing case files when my email pinged with a notification from the court system. Declan had filed the paperwork accepting the plea agreement at 8:30 in the morning. I opened the document and saw Andrew's signature at the bottom along with Declan's certification that his client understood the terms and was entering the plea voluntarily. The court scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks out on a Thursday afternoon. I immediately started working on my sentencing recommendation, pulling together all the evidence about Andrew's reckless behavior and complete lack of remorse. I also reached out to the owner of the car Andrew damaged and asked if she'd be willing to provide a victim impact statement at the hearing. She called me back within an hour and said she absolutely wanted to speak, because she still felt unsafe knowing someone had been driving that drunk in her neighborhood. The next week, I stayed late most nights working on the fraud case that Caitlin had assigned me to second chair. Wednesday evening around 7 o'clock, I was alone in the office reviewing financial records when the security guard called my desk phone. He told me Thomas was in the lobby asking to see me. My stomach dropped and I told the guard to inform Thomas that I was unavailable and that any communication should go through his brother's attorney. The guard said he'd pass along the message and I heard him talking to someone before he came back on the line and confirmed Thomas was leaving. I sat there for another 10 minutes trying to focus on the spreadsheets in front of me, but my hands were shaking too much to type properly. I packed up my stuff and left through the back entrance near the parking garage. The next morning, I got to my office early and opened my work email to find a message from Thomas sent at 11:30 the previous night. The subject line said, "Please read," and I almost deleted it without opening, but something made me click on it. The email was 3 paragraphs long and started with an apology for his family's behavior at Thanksgiving. He said he'd been thinking about that dinner for months and realized how badly everyone had treated me. He wrote that seeing me in court prosecuting Andrew made him understand how accomplished I really was and how wrong he'd been to doubt my abilities. The last paragraph begged me to give him another chance and said he'd changed since we broke up. I read through it twice and then forwarded the whole thing to Caitlin without typing any response. She came to my office 20 minutes later holding a printed copy of the email. She told me to document any further contact from Thomas and said if it became a pattern, we might need to address it formally through the court or the bar association. The sentencing hearing arrived on Thursday afternoon, and I walked into the courtroom carrying a folder with my recommendation and the victim impact statement. Andrew sat at the defense table next to Declan wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Kendall, Richard, Thomas, and Rachel filled the first row of the gallery behind the defense table. I took my seat at the prosecution table and organized my notes while we waited for the judge to enter. The bailiff called everyone to rise and Judge Hunter came in and sat down behind the bench. She asked if both sides were ready to proceed and Declan confirmed the plea agreement. I stood up and presented my sentencing recommendation, noting that Andrew had shown no genuine remorse for endangering others and seemed primarily concerned about how the consequences would affect his own life. I described the dashcam footage showing his reckless driving and the near miss with the pedestrian. I explained that Andrew left the scene of an accident and was found 3 blocks away, still too drunk to recite the alphabet. The owner of the damaged car stood up when the judge asked if she wanted to speak. She gave a brief statement about feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood after the incident, knowing someone had been driving that recklessly just a few blocks from her house where her kids played outside. Kendall suddenly stood up from the gallery and started talking directly to the judge before anyone could stop her. She said her son was a good person who made one mistake and didn't deserve to have his entire life ruined over something so minor. The judge's expression went cold and she firmly told Kendall to sit down immediately. Judge Hunter explained in a voice that carried through the whole courtroom that leaving the scene after causing an accident and nearly hitting a pedestrian while extremely drunk represented serious disregard for public safety. She said this wasn't one mistake, but a series of bad decisions that put innocent people at risk. Kendall sat down, but I could see her wiping tears from her face. Judge Hunter reviewed the plea agreement and said she was accepting it in full. She told Andrew he would report to county jail in 1 week to begin serving his 45 days with no possibility of early release. She went through each requirement slowly, making sure Andrew understood he had to complete 200 hours of community service within 1 year and attend alcohol counseling with proof of attendance. She explained the restitution amount he owed for the damaged car and the 18-month license suspension starting immediately. She finished by saying he'd need an ignition interlock device for 2 years after getting his license back. The judge asked if Andrew understood all the terms, and he nodded and said yes quietly. She told him these requirements were mandatory, and that failure to complete any of them would result in additional penalties and possible jail time. The bailiff walked over to Andrew and started explaining the procedures for reporting to county jail next Thursday morning. Kendall began crying loudly from the gallery, and Richard stood up demanding to know if there was an appeal process for such an unjust sentence. Judge Hunter looked at Richard with an expression that could freeze water. She informed him coldly that his son had pleaded guilty, and the sentence was completely standard for these offenses. She added that perhaps Andrew should have thought about consequences before getting behind the wheel drunk and nearly killing someone. Richard's face turned red, but he sat back down without saying anything else. The judge dismissed everyone, and I gathered my files while Declan talked quietly with Andrew at the defense table. I walked out of the courtroom into the hallway and headed toward the elevator. Rachel came running up behind me with her phone held up recording video. She started yelling that I targeted Andrew because of my breakup with Thomas, and that everyone knew I was abusing my position as a prosecutor. I kept walking without responding or making eye contact with her phone. 2 courthouse security guards appeared from the side hallway, and one of them stepped between Rachel and me. The other guard told Rachel firmly that she needed to stop filming and leave the building immediately. She argued that she had a right to be there, but the guards escorted her toward the exit while she continued yelling about how unfair everything was. I got on the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, finally letting out the breath I'd been holding since Kendall stood up in the courtroom. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and I walked straight to the parking garage, getting into my car before anyone else from the courtroom could follow me. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, but I managed to drive back to the office without incident. Caitlin was waiting by my desk when I got there, and she gestured toward the conference room without saying anything. I followed her inside, and she closed the door behind us before pulling out 2 chairs at the table. She sat down across from me and told me I handled everything exactly right from start to finish. The case preparation was thorough. My courtroom presence stayed professional under pressure, and I never let personal history compromise my judgment, even when Kendall tried to turn the sentencing into a circus. Roy had already called her to say he was impressed with how I managed such a difficult situation, and there were bigger cases coming my way because I proved I could handle the pressure. She asked if I wanted to grab lunch to decompress, and I nodded because sitting alone at my desk felt impossible right then. We walked 2 blocks to a small cafe that prosecutors frequented and ordered sandwiches at the counter. Caitlin talked about her early cases while we waited for our food, telling me about the time she had to prosecute her high school boyfriend's father for embezzlement and how strange it felt to see someone from her past sitting at the defense table. She said the weirdness never fully goes away, but you learn to separate the professional from the personal, and eventually the job becomes just the job, regardless of who's involved. Our sandwiches arrived and we ate while she asked about my next assignments and whether I felt ready to take on more complex cases. I told her I wanted to keep building my trial experience, and she smiled and said that was exactly the right answer. That evening, Cheryl met me at my favorite Italian restaurant downtown, and we sat at a corner table near the window. She ordered wine for both of us before I could even look at the menu, and raised her glass in a toast to me surviving the most awkward case in legal history. We clinked glasses, and I took a long sip before setting it down and realizing my shoulders had finally dropped from where they'd been tensed up near my ears all day. The case was over, and Andrew faced real consequences for his actions instead of getting another free pass from his family's money and connections. I proved to myself that I could handle prosecuting someone connected to my past without falling apart or compromising my ethics. Cheryl reached across the table and squeezed my hand and told me she was proud of me for walking away from Thomas when I did, because staying would have meant accepting their treatment forever. The waiter brought our pasta dishes, and we ate while catching up on everything besides the case. She told me about her new position at a corporate firm and how boring contract review was compared to the courtroom drama I dealt with daily. I laughed and said she could have some of my drama if she wanted it, but she shook her head and said she preferred her stress to come from missing semicolons instead of hostile families. We finished dinner and split a dessert while making plans to take a weekend trip somewhere soon, because I needed a break from the legal district and everything associated with Thomas's family. 2 weeks later, Roy called me into his office and handed me a thick file folder containing reports from a dozen residential burglaries. The cases all happened in the same neighborhood over the past 3 months, and the detective assigned to investigate believed they were connected based on the entry methods and items stolen. Roy wanted me to coordinate with the detective team and analyze the patterns across all the crime scenes to build a strong case once they identified a suspect. I carried the folder back to my desk and spread out the reports in chronological order, studying the details of each break-in. The burglar always entered through back windows or doors during weekday afternoons when most residents were at work. He took small electronics, jewelry, and cash, while ignoring larger items that would be harder to carry. 3 victims had security camera footage showing a man in dark clothes and a baseball cap, but the images were too grainy to identify facial features. I spent the next week meeting with detectives and visiting the crime scenes to understand the geographic pattern. The burglaries formed a cluster within a 10-block radius and always happened on Tuesdays or Thursdays between noon and 4 p.m. I created a map marking each location, and noticed they progressed in a spiral pattern moving outward from a central point. The detective said that suggested the suspect lived or worked near the center of the spiral, and I agreed it was worth focusing surveillance in that area. I threw myself into analyzing every detail of the case, grateful for work that required my full attention and left no room to think about anything else. Thomas sent me 3 more emails over the following days before I forwarded them to the office administrator and requested formal intervention. The administrator drafted a letter on official DA letterhead warning that continued unwanted communication with a prosecutor could be considered harassment and might result in a restraining order. The letter went out certified mail, and Thomas stopped contacting me after he signed for it. I mentioned it to Cheryl over coffee one weekend, and she started laughing so hard she nearly spit out her drink. She said threatening legal action was apparently my love language now, and maybe I should put that in my dating profile if I ever tried online dating again. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling because she wasn't entirely wrong about how comfortable I'd become using legal mechanisms to solve personal problems. The truth was that practicing law had changed how I approached conflict in every area of my life, and I no longer felt powerless when someone tried to push boundaries or ignore my clearly stated limits. 3 months after Andrew's sentencing, I stood in a different courtroom preparing for my first solo trial on a domestic assault case. The defendant had allegedly punched his girlfriend during an argument, and she'd called the police with a black eye and split lip. His attorney was a man named Harris Webb, who'd been practicing for 20 years and had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination tactics. I'd spent weeks preparing my witnesses and reviewing every piece of evidence until I knew the case better than my own address. The jury was selected and seated by mid-morning, and the judge asked if both sides were ready to proceed. I stood up and said I was ready, and Harris nodded from the defense table. My opening statement laid out the facts clearly and simply, explaining how the victim would testify about the assault and how the responding officer would describe her injuries and the defendant's behavior when he arrived at the scene. Harris gave his opening next and argued that the victim had a history of lying and that her injuries could have come from anywhere. The victim took the stand first, and I walked her through the events of that night step by step, asking specific questions about what happened before, during, and after the assault. She stayed calm and consistent, even when Harris tried to rattle her during cross-examination, by bringing up past relationship problems that had nothing to do with whether the defendant hit her. The responding officer testified next and described finding the victim crying on her front porch with visible injuries, while the defendant sat inside the house refusing to come out. I entered photos of her injuries into evidence, and the jury passed them around while several members grimaced at the images. Harris called the defendant to testify, and he claimed the victim had attacked him first, and he was only defending himself, but his story contradicted the physical evidence and the officer's observations. My closing argument focused on the credibility of the victim and the officer compared to the defendant's convenient excuse that appeared nowhere in his initial statement to police. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Roy called me into his office the next morning, and I sat down across from his desk, wondering if something had gone wrong with the verdict. Instead, he smiled and said he wanted to offer me a position on the Major Crimes Unit, handling more serious felonies like armed robbery, aggravated assault, and complex fraud cases. It was a promotion that usually took prosecutors 3 years to achieve, but my trial skills and work ethic had impressed everyone in the office enough that he wanted to move me up early. I felt my throat tighten and had to swallow twice before I could speak to accept the position. He told me I'd start transitioning to the new unit next month and would be working with some of the most experienced prosecutors in the office who could teach me advanced trial techniques. I thanked him and walked back to my desk in a daze before pulling out my phone to call my parents. My mom answered on the second ring, and I told her about the promotion before she could even say hello. She started crying happy tears and called for my dad to pick up the other phone so they could both hear the news. My dad's voice came through saying he always knew I'd be successful and that he was proud of how hard I'd worked to get here. Their support felt warm and solid and completely different from the way Thomas's family had made their approval conditional on me meeting their arbitrary standards. I stayed on the phone with them for 20 minutes while they asked questions about the new position and what kinds of cases I'd be handling. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and let myself feel genuinely happy about my accomplishments, without any voice in my head questioning whether I deserved the recognition. Caitlin texted me that evening asking if I wanted to go shopping for new suits befitting my promotion, and I met her at a department store downtown the next Saturday. She pulled blazers and dress pants off racks while I tried them on in the fitting room and modeled each combination for her approval. We laughed about how Kendall had insisted I couldn't have really passed the bar exam while I was now getting promoted to prosecute major felonies. Caitlin said the best revenge was living well and succeeding on your own merits, and I was finally starting to believe that was true instead of just something people said to make you feel better. I bought 3 new suits and 2 pairs of professional shoes that made me feel confident and capable. We grabbed dinner after shopping, and Caitlin told me stories about her early days in major crimes, warning me about which defense attorneys played fair and which ones tried every trick to throw prosecutors off their game. She said I was ready for the increased responsibility, and that she looked forward to watching me handle bigger cases. 4 months after Andrew's sentencing, I stopped at a coffee shop near the courthouse to grab an afternoon caffeine boost. I was standing in line checking my phone when I heard someone say my name and looked up to see Thomas standing 3 feet away with a woman I didn't recognize. She was blonde and wearing expensive clothes, and she looked uncomfortable the moment she realized who I was. Thomas introduced her as his girlfriend Sarah, and she gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I said it was nice to meet her and turned back toward the counter to order my coffee. Thomas tried to make small talk about work, but I kept my answers brief and polite while the barista made my drink. Sarah stood slightly behind Thomas, and I noticed her glancing at the exit like she wanted to leave. My coffee was ready within minutes, and I grabbed it from the counter and said goodbye before walking out without looking back. I felt nothing watching Thomas and his new girlfriend disappear behind me, except mild relief that I wasn't the woman standing next to him anymore. That evening, I met Cheryl for our weekly dinner and told her about the coffee shop encounter. She pointed out that feeling nothing was growth, that indifference was the real opposite of love, and that I'd clearly moved past the hurt his family caused. I realized she was right because seeing Thomas didn't make my stomach drop, or my hands shake, or my mind spin with what-ifs about our relationship. He was just someone I used to know who made poor choices about who to prioritize, and I'd built a successful career and a happy life without him or his family's approval. My caseload in major crimes grew heavier with each passing week. I prosecuted armed robberies where defendants held up convenience stores with guns. I handled aggravated assaults where victims ended up in hospitals with broken bones and knife wounds. I worked complex fraud schemes where business owners stole hundreds of thousands from investors through fake companies and forged documents. Each case challenged me differently. The robbery cases required coordinating with police detectives who collected evidence from crime scenes. The assault cases meant interviewing traumatized victims who struggled to recount what happened to them. The fraud cases involved studying financial records until my eyes blurred from spreadsheets and bank statements. Defense attorneys who initially dismissed me as inexperienced started treating me with respect after I won several trials. Judges called me well-prepared and thorough in my presentations. Other prosecutors asked me for advice on witness examination techniques. The reputation I built felt earned through late nights studying case law and weekends practicing opening statements in my apartment. 6 months after Andrew finished his jail sentence, I stopped at a sandwich shop near the courthouse for lunch. I was walking back to my car when I spotted someone in an orange vest picking up trash along the highway median. Andrew was using one of those grabber tools to collect soda cans and fast food wrappers while cars zoomed past. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds before he looked down at the ground and kept working. I kept walking to my car without breaking stride. He faced real consequences for driving drunk and endangering people. Maybe he learned something from losing his license and spending weekends cleaning highways. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I did my job and moved on to the next case. 3 weeks later, my law school called asking if I would speak to current students about careers in prosecution. Standing in the same lecture hall where I'd sat through criminal procedure classes 3 years ago felt strange. The students looked so young and nervous, taking notes on everything I said about trial preparation and witness interviews. I talked about finding work that matched your values instead of just chasing big firm salaries. I mentioned not letting anyone make you doubt your accomplishments or question whether you deserved your success. Several students approached me afterward wanting mentorship advice. One woman said she was worried about being taken seriously as a prosecutor because she went to a state school instead of an Ivy League university. I told her I went to state school too and graduated third in my class, and that competence in the courtroom mattered more than where you got your degree. She looked relieved and asked for my email address. Roy stopped by my office the following Monday with a thick file folder. He dropped it on my desk and said I was assigned as second chair on a corruption case involving a city council member accused of taking bribes. The lead prosecutor was someone named Jennifer who'd been with the office for 15 years and won some of the biggest cases in county history. Working closely with her on such a major case felt like validation that I'd truly arrived as an attorney. The case involved a council member who voted to approve construction contracts in exchange for cash payments and expensive gifts. We had bank records showing deposits that matched the dates of key votes. We had recorded phone calls where the council member discussed payment amounts. We had testimony from the construction company owner who agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Jennifer assigned me to handle several witnesses and help prepare exhibits. I spent days organizing hundreds of pages of financial documents into binders with color-coded tabs. I practiced my witness examinations until I could anticipate every possible defense objection. Jennifer reviewed my work and made suggestions about pacing and emphasis, teaching me techniques she'd developed over years of trials. 8 months after Andrew completed his sentence, Cheryl dragged me to a legal networking event at a hotel downtown. Prosecutors from surrounding counties gathered in a conference room drinking wine and complaining about difficult judges. I met other young attorneys who understood the pressure of heavy caseloads and tight budgets. We swapped stories about defense attorneys who tried dirty tricks and witnesses who changed their testimony on the stand. One prosecutor from the next county over told me about a case where the defendant's mother tried to bribe her in the courthouse bathroom. Another described a trial where the defense attorney accidentally admitted his client's guilt during opening statements. The conversations were energizing in a way that dinners with non-lawyers never were. These people got the work and the stress and the strange satisfaction of winning a guilty verdict. I exchanged phone numbers with several attorneys who became genuine friends over the following months. While I was preparing exhibits for the corruption trial, my phone buzzed with a text from my law school roommate. She attended a charity event where Kendall was complaining loudly about the prosecutor who targeted her son. My roommate apparently informed Kendall that I graduated third in our class, and suggested that maybe her son shouldn't have driven drunk and endangered innocent people. Kendall apparently went quiet and walked away without responding. I smiled at my phone and went back to organizing financial records. The corruption trial started on a Monday morning with jury selection. Jennifer and I spent 2 days questioning potential jurors about their views on government and their ability to follow complex financial evidence. The trial itself lasted 3 weeks with dozens of witnesses and hundreds of exhibits. I handled several key witnesses, including a forensic accountant who traced the bribe money through multiple bank accounts. My examination was clear and focused, walking the jury through each transaction with charts and timelines. The defense attorney tried to confuse the accountant with complicated questions about accounting standards, but my preparation held up and the testimony remained solid. I also examined the construction company owner who described handing cash to the council member in parking garages and restaurant bathrooms. The defendant's expensive legal team couldn't shake his testimony because we'd corroborated every meeting with phone records and surveillance footage. Jennifer told me during a lunch break that my witness preparation was exceptional. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The lead prosecutor credited my witness preparation as a major factor in the victory when she talked to reporters outside the courthouse. Roy called me into his office the next morning and said I was ready to start handling major cases as lead prosecutor. The professional recognition felt like everything I'd worked toward since passing the bar exam. 9 months after Andrew finished his sentence, I stood up to give my opening statement in an aggravated assault case as lead prosecutor. The defendant had beaten his girlfriend badly enough to break her jaw and 3 ribs. I felt completely comfortable and confident explaining the evidence to the jury. No trace of the doubt that Thomas's family tried to plant in my mind remained. The trial lasted 4 days and the jury convicted on all charges. That evening, I treated myself to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. I sat alone at a table reviewing my case notes and planning my next trial. The career I built was exactly what I wanted when I first decided to go to law school. I proved every single one of Kendall's dismissive comments wrong without ever speaking to her again. My accomplishments spoke louder than her mockery ever could. 10 months had passed since I walked out of Thomas's house and Roy called me into his office on a Tuesday morning to assign me the biggest case of my career. A major drug trafficking operation had been operating through the port for 2 years, and federal agents had finally gathered enough evidence to bring charges against 15 defendants. Roy sat behind his desk looking at me seriously and said he wanted me as lead prosecutor because I'd proven myself capable of handling complex cases with multiple moving parts. I spent the next 3 weeks working 16-hour days with a team of DEA agents and forensic accountants who walked me through shipping manifests and wire transfers and surveillance photos taken from unmarked vans. The evidence filled 12 bankers' boxes, and I organized everything into a timeline that showed how the operation moved product from cargo ships to distribution points across 3 states. 2 investigators named Harris and Jennifer helped me prepare witness interviews, and we rehearsed testimony until I could anticipate every question the defense might ask. The case would likely make headlines when it went to trial, and I felt the weight of that responsibility every time I reviewed another stack of documents proving how much cocaine had moved through our city. Cheryl met me for dinner on Friday night to celebrate my 1-year anniversary at the DA's office, and we sat at our favorite Italian restaurant drinking wine while she looked at me with this proud expression. She pointed out how different I seemed from the woman who'd sat at that Thanksgiving table clutching her bar exam results while everyone laughed. I was more confident now, more certain of my abilities, completely comfortable with my professional identity regardless of what anyone thought. The doubt that Thomas's family tried to plant in my mind had disappeared somewhere between my first trial victory and my 50th case file. Cheryl raised her glass and said I'd become exactly the lawyer I was meant to be, and I believed her because the evidence supported it. I ran into Declan at the courthouse the following week, and he stopped me in the hallway to mention that Andrew had completed all his court requirements and seemed genuinely changed by the experience. Andrew was attending AA meetings 3 times a week, even though his sentence only required 1, and Declan said he'd never seen someone take their recovery that seriously after a first offense. Then Declan casually mentioned that Thomas and his new girlfriend had broken up because his family treated her the same way they'd treated me, making her feel small and stupid at every family gathering until she couldn't take it anymore. I felt a moment of sympathy for her before moving on with my day, because that wasn't my problem to solve anymore. I sat at my desk that evening preparing for the drug trafficking trial and thought about how far I'd come from that woman at Thanksgiving dinner. I'd built a successful career through hard work and actual competence, proved myself in courtroom after courtroom, and learned that the only validation I needed was my own knowledge that I'd earned everything I achieved. Thomas's family's opinion had never mattered, and walking away from people who couldn't recognize my worth was the best decision I ever made.